In this lesson, I want to share a few tips that should help you solve some of the basic unwrapping challenges that you might face. First up is skewing, and we sort of looked at this in a previous lesson, but let's take this complex object here. Well, it's not too complex in terms of how to model it, but when you think of it in terms of a piece of paper, imagine trying to lay this down flat. It would definitely tear somewhere. So it's definitely going to have a little bit of skewing as we unwrap this, no matter what we do, unless we add some seams. So I'll hit tab to go into edit mode, and you can see the result that happened with just a U and unwrap without any seams at all. And we get this skewing right in the middle of this quad right here. Now, if we had a subdivision surface modifier and turn this up, then that would reduce the skewing. So we could kind of mask it that way. But if this is for a game or we're using a low poly asset, then this isn't really a fix. It's just kind of a band-aid. So the main problem here is that we're skewing this rectangle here to be, well, not a rectangle shape. So we could try to fix this by rotating these kind of into place and putting this back, and that would fix the skewing. You can see it's no longer skewed there, but now it's skewed up towards the top. So of course what you could try to do is add more seams like we've done previously, and that would certainly fix it. We could add a seam around this end on here, right click and mark seam. We could do the same thing for these edge loops. Well, let me just unwrap that first so you can see the result. U and unwrap. And so that helped, but definitely we're still getting skewing along this quad. So let's also add seams to these edge loops on either side. Right click and mark seam. Select everything, U and unwrap. And there we go, that did fix our problem. But let's say that for whatever reason, you couldn't put seams right along those edges. Well, what you could do is use the other unwrap method and see if it works any better. So I'll take all these, hit U and unwrap again, see what we got, and we're still getting that skewing along here. Well, look what happens when we change our unwrap method in the redo panel from angle-based to conformal. And immediately we get a much better result. So we'll still get a little bit of skewing up here along these edges, but it's pretty minor. I've found that this conformal method works a lot better in a few edge cases when it comes to low poly modeling, especially hard surface low poly modeling, when you've got bevels and things like that. Most of the time though, it gives a much worse result, which is why it's not the default. So let me show you what happens if we try to unwrap Suzanne using the conformal method rather than the angle-based method. Because angle-based, of course, tries to keep all of the angle stretching to a minimum, and it usually lays things out pretty evenly. If we hit U and unwrap here, you can see that it's definitely skewed a lot more to one side, and it just gives us a pretty bad result. If we switch this back to angle-based though, then we get a much better result that we would expect. So usually for organic things and high poly things, angle-based is going to be better like 99% of the time. But just in those few percent of edge cases where you're getting that skewing along the quad, then you're either going to have to add more seams or try the conformal method. Now, one thing that you may have noticed as we've been working with UVs is that they tend to jump around as we unwrap, especially if we're using live unwrap. And as a demonstration, I'm going to turn on live unwrap, go to UV and live unwrap, and also in the UV editor, it's there as well. Though in later versions of Blender, as I pointed out earlier, this will only be an option in the UV editor, and you don't have to worry about it in the 3D view. So you won't be able to find it there anymore, and it simplifies things quite a bit. So let's turn on selection sync as well here, just so that we can see this as we're working. And let me just take some of these seams away. I'll select them, right click, and clear seam. As you can see, the islands just jump around. Well, maybe we want the eyeballs and the ears to stay in the same place because we're not really touching them. Well, what we could do is just select them, and again, be careful when you're selecting things using selection sync in the UV editor. Right now it doesn't appear to be attached to anything else, so it's not a problem, but we can move this over here. Select this one, move it over here, and what we can do is pin these to the side. So to pin something, we just need to select it. I'll go to vertex select mode here, select these two vertices right in the center, right click and pin. Now when we unwrap, let's say we take some of these edges, right click and mark seam. Everything else is going to jump around, but those will stay in the same spot, or at least those vertices, and the rest of the mesh will unwrap around it. So this is pretty cool. We can do the same thing for the ears as well. Let's take one there and one there, right click and pin. Then let's make a couple more seams so it updates, and you can see that they stayed in the same spot while just the monkey updated. Well, we could also pin the monkey as well. We just take one vertex that's like right in the middle of the face, Go to vertex select mode, right click and pin, or you could also just use the hotkey P. Then as we unwrap, go back to edge select mode, right click and mark seam. Then that vertex is going to stay in the same spot. So be careful using this early on. It can lead you into trouble. When I was testing this, I of course fell for the classic sync selection issue where I pinned this top vertex here, not remembering that of course with sync selection on, that also references vertices in other areas as well. You can see it connects to all three of those. Well, if I right click and pin that here, and then go ahead and clear these seams, then we get some pretty wild and tangled results as it tries to keep those vertices in the same spot, even though I only pinned that one vertex. It's just referenced in 3 places, and it pinned all of them for me. So we generally don't want to do that. I'm going to select that vertex right there at the top, right click and unpin, and there we go. It is interesting that if you select the pin and hit G and move it around, then you'll select the whole island and everything that it's attached to. So that's kind of cool as well. But to unpin everything, we just select everything and hit Alt P or right click and unpin, and we'll be back to normal. Another common problem that I see is the UVs getting stretched. And this is just if you manipulate your object in object mode rather than edit mode. So let's say we're modeling this perfect cube here. We've gotten it to be exactly cube shaped and we're very happy with the result, but we want to make some edits and maybe scale it along the x-axis, scale along the y-axis, and now we're happy. This is beautiful. Well, if we hit tab to go to edit mode and unwrap this guy, let's go to set the seams, and actually let's select everything first. Seams from islands, and there we go. Now when we hit everything U and unwrap, then it'll unwrap in that cross shape. Okay, but we still are getting a very stretched result, and all of the quads in the UV view are the original square shape. And that's because the object itself is scaled, and remember from the mesh modeling fundamentals, the object is just a container for the vertices and not representative of the vertices themselves. So the vertices have no idea that the object is scaled, and so it just thinks that it's the same shape as a cube. So really all we need to do, as you might have guessed, is apply the scale, or as it's called in other software packages, freeze the transformations. So we just hit Control A and apply scale. And you'll see the scale jump over here on the right in the object properties back to 1, 1, 1. And now this transformation has been applied to the locations of the vertices themselves. So now when we hit tab to go into edit mode, hit U and unwrap, then everything will look as we might expect. Another common problem that I see when it comes to stretching is if we do a Smart UV project. So let's hit U and Smart UV project. And then you can see this is very stretched. And the larger our faces are, or the more like elongated our faces are, the more this is going to become apparent. So if we scale this along the x-axis here, U and Smart UV project, you can see it's all very, very squished. Now the reason for this is because the Smart UV project by default has stretched to UV bounds turned on. And I'm not really sure why this isn't a default option, but it takes all of the UVs and stretches them to whatever the dimensions of your image are. So we can just turn this off, and there we get a much better result without any of that skewing. So again, the 2 reasons for stretching are either not applying scale in object mode or accidentally having stretch to UV bounds turned on in Smart UV project. So always apply scale before unwrapping and you should be good. Now I'm going to transform this back into a cube here because I want to show you something with modifiers next. That's close enough. Okay, let's do a U and unwrap one more time. So get that nice square grid. Though it gave us an upside down cross, which I'm pretty sure is bad luck, but we'll continue anyway. Let's go to the modifiers tab. And we could add a subdivision surface modifier the normal way, or we could use a hotkey that I really like, which is just hitting Control and any number 1 through 5 on the top row of the keyboard. So I'll hit Control and 3, and that'll just give whatever objects we have selected a subdivision surface modifier with level of 3. So that works for any object. Very handy. I'll hit Control Z to undo that. But that's just one way of very quickly switching between different subsurf levels in the viewport. So we can hit 1, 4, 2, whatever we need. Okay, so that's very fun, but let's right click and shade this smooth for now, maybe bump this up to level 4 so it's nice and smooth. And we'll see that the UVs don't quite line up with the seam. So if we hit tab to go into edit mode, we can see that, let's figure out which edge is which. Okay, so this face is the one at the bottom. And if we try to line this up exactly, you can see that the top and bottom edge are lined up pretty much right along those edges there. But in the 3D view, you can see that it's being skewed. And that's because the subdivision surface modifier also modifies the UVs and subdivides those as well. And we can change the behavior of that under the advanced options. So we have this UV smooth parameter, and it's by default set to smooth and keep corners, which is a really good default because otherwise things look pretty gross. We can see that here with Suzanne. I'll bump up the subsurf levels to 3 here. And if I switch this to sharp, then you can see we're going to get some pretty bad results as it keeps the low poly UVs, but applies them to the smooth geometry. And that looks very strange. So in most cases, we want to keep this as smooth and keep corners. However, in this case, we may want to switch this to sharp. And as you can see, now this lines up exactly as we would expect. So in some rare cases, you might need to do that. And for any modifier that modifies your UVs, you're typically going to have an option to change the behavior of that. Now you can actually see the subdivision surface happening in the UV editor, which is pretty cool. What we need to do is just go into edit mode to actually see our UVs here. I'll try to flip this around so I don't go to hell. And then we need to go to the sidebar by hitting N. Under view, we can go to modified and turn that on. And then if we zoom in, you can see the modified result overlaid on the UVs, and you can see it stretching between these different points. If we switch this to sharp, then it just snaps back to the original lines. So personally, I think this should be on by default because any modifiers that change how your UVs are laid out should probably be apparent, but I guess in some cases it could definitely add a lot of noise and you might not want that. It could be a little bit distracting. But if something's happening that you're not sure why it is, try turning on modified. Again, that's in the sidebar under view, or in future versions of Blender that'll just be in the overlays popover right here on the top right of the header.